I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Zachary Kallenborn, a PhD student in war studies at King's College London, studying global catastrophes. He's also affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, and George Mason University. Zach has an M.A. in Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and a bachelor's in Mathematics and International Relations from the University of Puget Sound. His work has been featured in numerous international media outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, NPR, Forbes, New Scientist, Wired, Foreign Policy, the BBC, and many others. So, Zach, welcome back, sir. It has been several months. It is a true honor to have you with me today.
Thank you, as always.
Well, so today I wanted to circle back around to the topic of drones. You are my drone expert. You cover a number of different global catastrophes and technologies, but drones are one of the areas that you have been just so outspoken on. And we've covered this topic in the past. So I wanted to come back to this because it is moving so rapidly in terms of military technology. It's repeatedly showing up in the headlines. And I wanted to start by asking, what are some of the biggest changes, advances, and surprises with military drones that have happened over the last few months?
Yeah, so there's been a bit. One of the biggest, of course, is that we've just seen the continuation of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And thankfully, some of those lessons are starting to permeate to global militaries as folks have increasingly learned, okay, drones are kind of a big deal here. That's been a more larger, bigger picture trend that have been, slowly unfolding over the past couple of years. But in terms of more of the last few months, one of the biggest changes or developments, just actually, I think it was about a week or so ago, there was some reporting that came out in Reuters and I think followed up in some other places about China starting to support the Russian drone industry as part of the war effort, which I think is a fairly significant development on multiple fronts. So first, of course, you have China playing, from the geopolitics perspective, you have China playing a much bigger role within the conflict. And to the degree that China and Russia develop larger defensive ties, that's certainly very concerning from a United States and allied government perspective. Now, I'm not a regional expert, and I understand, there's at least quite a few historical, ideological, personality, and other sort of challenges, to question how close China-Russia ties might end up growing. But just to the degree that there is that support, even on defense technology, I think that is significant because it means, you have a lot more resources, a lot more technology, a lot more capability going into the fight. And even if China isn't giving Russia its, highest end capabilities, that certainly helps prep China for a possible conflict with the United States in terms of getting some of its technology more battle hardened and having the direct experience of having used some of this technology, use some of these resources in the war zone, and which also makes me wonder about what China might be getting from this beyond just, of course, they're selling some of their stuff. Like what information is maybe Russia sharing about the efficacy of either the Chinese technology or others that might help China in many conflicts. I think it's also significant at a more conceptual level, as I think it underscores some of the larger trends that we've seen in drone warfare. That is, a significant aspect of drone warfare is very much about mass. That is, what we've seen continuously in this conflict is that both sides have really churned through large numbers of drones and often fairly quickly. And so there's a key question like, okay, how do you maintain and how do you continue that production over a large scale period? And so for Russia, it appears that at least part of the answer is to go outside and go to countries like China to get some of those resources. So I think that's probably the biggest in the past few months. I'm sure there's other trends we could talk about, but we can pull those up.
Yeah. Well, the reason that I reached out to you, I want to outline a couple of videos here, and I'm jumping around in my questions, but I saw one the other day about a massive Chinese, I believe it was New Year's celebration from last year, with hundreds, perhaps thousands of coordinated, synchronized drones. Now, in this case, it was a celebration. They were up in the air doing complex, synchronized acrobatics, flashing lights, and, I mean, everyone was having a good time. Nothing dangerous happened. But it struck me that the AI control over this is absolutely tremendous. And if that was a weapons system, if it had been modified or changed, as it probably easily could, then it would potentially be something very devastating. So that was, I guess, the first that came to mind. But the second video that I saw was a drone flying into the turret seam of a tank, right? And so in this case, I believe this was Ukraine war, and it was a Russian tank, and you could see the drone fly up to the turret, and it was basically just doing, close-up analysis with the camera. It found its weak spot, and it flew in right under the turret and destroyed the tank with an explosive that wouldn't have been big enough to penetrate the armor. And so the thing that came out of that for me, after seeing both of these videos, I think in the same day, was I asked myself, is this fundamentally changing the future of warfare? And are we taking warfare to a place where humans won't be able to keep up?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, I'll note that with those large swarms of drones, typically what they are is not actually really using AI. What those often are in those like light shows is that they're actually just following pre-programmed GPS routes where they fly to point A to point B,
Okay.
and so they're actually cameras on the ground that are like watching and monitoring, like, oh, you're supposed to be the dragon's eye, stop, go hang out, stop being by the tail, go move back into the eye position, that type of thing. So it's not the type of like real time engagement and control and like complex behaviors that we might expect in the future. That said, just the fact that we're seeing that is certainly an illustration of what the technology is capable of. And I do think it's actually very important that like the visibility of it in terms of like showing where this is going. It's like even if it's not technically where the overarching technology may go, it's a very clear example of what it could do, and that can help understand, well, okay, maybe these swarms are, or these drones are not AI enabled, they aren't collaborating, but what if they were? What would that actually look like? To your larger question though about sort of the role of humans, I'm not really sure. I think there's definitely advantages that you get, the mass being that big one, where you can have these
Yeah.
large number of drones, as well as when you couple that with some of the precision that you get, where you can have various machine vision and very precise targeting to hit, very particular parts of, a tank, a plane, a boat, whatever it is that you're wanting to blow up at any given moment. And so when you combine that, I do think it is very significant. That said, I'm inclined to think that um, the role of humans might change, but it's not going to go away by any means. Ultimately, we fight wars because people are doing something, or we want them to do something that they are not. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. So there may be changes in the details, and I think they are very important changes to the details, particularly how we think about awareness on the battlefield with the huge amounts of information that these are collecting, how we think about the role of the defense industrial base in generating this production, how we think about the logistic needs, because even if you're able to build I don't know 100,000 drones or just whatever, you need a way to get those to the battlefield, and you need the logistic systems to do that, which means depending on the context, that may be trains, it may be airplanes, it may be sea lift, it may be wide range of capabilities. And so in many of those areas, although you can imagine humans coming out of some of that, nonetheless there are still going to be humans. And I think even with even these smaller unmanned systems, there is still humans playing fairly critical roles in that. That is, there are operators in many of these,
Yeah.
and sometimes they may work in teams with multiple folks working together, where it's not just the actual drone pilot, but you may have like navigators, especially if you talk about some longer range like one-way attack drones. You might also have, say, like video analysts who are, monitoring what's happening, and you may have folks monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum to try to understand, what's the potential threats that are out there. So I think it's less a matter of humans going away and more a matter of humans taking on different types of roles than they would have been before.
Well, and I appreciate you sharing that. I want to stay on this topic for just a moment. The Russian Kalishnikov drone that came out earlier this year is reportedly capable of both remote and autonomous operation. I'm not sure if that's been confirmed yet, but that was at least the rumor. And I'm wondering if the advent of jamming technology, and I've seen several drone jamming systems that are supposed to stop that operator signal, will push drones towards autonomy and ultimately towards making the decision to kill without human intervention.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'd quibble a bit on sort of the order of that, in that, jamming technology has been around for a really long time. Like, that's not really like
Mm.
a sort of a new development. But there definitely has been a continuous evolution and growth in that sort of jamming, counter jamming space with, on both sides trying to improve their countermeasures to jam from, apparently now it's basically standard practice in Ukrainian drones to have frequency hopping where you move between different frequencies, because the other ones keep getting jammed. And that way, as long as you keep moving and your adversary can't jam that full spectrum, you can at least try to have some control. But on both sides, yes, there's absolutely an interest in autonomy to sort of mitigate that, in which you sort of, because if you remove that jamming, whether it's either the command and control type jamming or the GNS jamming of the actual navigation systems, if you can have systems that don't rely on those communication systems for taking commands to pilot or for navigation purposes, that can be a great value, but that does require things like incorporating machine vision systems to better recognize particular types of targets, or alternatively, recognize the terrain that you're on and map that against a pre-existing understanding of what this, the terrain and the maps in this area should be, to say, oh, that's this particular mountain that maps with what I understand where this mountain is supposed to be, which implies that I'm, over here, that type of thing. And similarly, the use of AI and machine vision, sort of with terminal guidance systems, where the very last sort of minutes of where they're, where the
Yeah.
operator might say, "Oh, that's a tank, go and blow it up." And then potentially, of course, you also have the interest in sort of like larger things that some of the activists have been more concerned about, where you have drones floating around looking for any sort of tank and then blowing it up. And there has been some suggestions that Russia's Lancet system has done some of that. But there's also concerns about whether it worked or not. There's some suggestion, reports indicate that it didn't work very well. That was too prone to error, and they just kind of turned it off.
Ah, well, another area that I wanted to touch on was the global trend towards declining birth rates, as well as a national trend in the United States that disqualifies, I believe it is the majority of Americans at this point, from service due to simply not meeting the fitness and health requirements. And the reason I mention this actually comes out of an article I saw 3 days ago about China's declining birth rate. And
Hmm.
so I think one of the assumptions in military strategy for a long time now has been that they have this massive number of soldiers, which is true and will stay true for the foreseeable future, but it may not be true for as long as we think with these declining birth rates, right? And so as civilization moves forward and people become more sedentary, we're seeing fewer people are able to qualify, and we're just seeing a global, decline in births. Do you think that'll push towards autonomy, autonomous weapons, things along those lines? Because we are able to, as you said, we're able to put mass on the battlefield with those.
I'm less sure. I mean, I think there's definitely an element of that, absolutely. But the challenge is, as I mentioned, just because we have the drones doesn't mean that people are going away. And I think in many cases we can expect that to still be the case. Certainly, we've seen in Ukraine that unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned undersea vehicle, I think undersea vehicles have also been increasingly used. But primarily, it's often been more as adjuncts to manned systems. Partially, I think that's because of technology, where it hasn't just reached the point, and some of that is also just, I think, just inherently it's much more difficult to get unmanned systems to do some of these much more complicated things. So, like if we think about like a large man, like a destroyer or a naval
Mm,
vessel, like those are big. complex systems. Getting a
Yeah.
autonomous system to do all of that, even if it can do a handful of things, that's going to be really, really difficult. And ultimately, a lot of that is going to success is really going to require a lot of adaptation, a lot of like creativity, a lot of like human cognition that AIs and computer systems are not yet capable of. I also, I see that trend. My interpretation is a huge part of that decline, maybe not so much the birth rates, but at least in terms of the larger recruiting issues that we're seeing, are more a larger product of some of the geopolitics that have happened. That is, you know, after 9/11 and the attacks there, we saw huge spikes in recruitment and folks
Yeah.
coming and joining. And I believe that continued a bit, with like the fights against Islamic State and the larger war on terror. But now we've kind of wound down a bit. Like, yeah, China's a concern, but it's not like a big existential threat that we're immediately really concerned about. So I see a lot of the decline in recruitment issues as being more a product of the current fights that we have, or perhaps the lack thereof, where it's less meaningful. There's not a esprit de corps, come save the country, as there might have been before, and so it becomes more just like, okay, this is another job to some extent, and one that has some real downsides to it. Plenty of upsides as well, of course, but which also implies that it's somewhat temporary, that if we actually do find ourselves in a major conflict, well, I would expect quite a lot of that to change. I think the other element, and why I'm somewhat skeptical, is that going back to my earlier point, that ultimately, we go to war because we want humans to do things or want them to stop doing things, which
Yeah.
means I think even to the degree that war becomes dominated by more unmanned systems, there's going to be limits in terms of how much that can actually be involved. Because ultimately, it's the decision makers, and one of the things we have seen as well with unmanned systems is that the losses of them are generally not very escalatory. Like when Russia tried to was messing with, I think it was like an MQ-9 that was the big predator drone that was floating in the Reaper. I always get them confused. That was floating in the Black Sea, or flying above the Black Sea. Like there was some, I think, some stern words from the United States, but like we didn't blow things up in retaliation. Like it wasn't really that big of a deal. So similarly, if we imagine that there's like this big robotic conflict and, China blows up a bunch of US robots, like, are we really going to care that much? Because ultimately what we care about is the people, and ultimately, because they bleed and they have families and they have things that they care about. Robots have none of those.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Robots don't require food, housing, disability benefits, anything like that. So
Yeah.
there is kind of that long-term cost savings, right? And I think, coming out of Iraq, when you look at IED injuries and things like that, that
Mhm.
may also factor into this calculus, because the long-term cost of those casualties, even if the person wasn't killed, taking care of them, rehabilitating them, trying to heal them and bring them back, that is very, very expensive. Whereas in the case of a drone, if it's broke, many times you can just throw it away.
Absolutely. And there's definitely a imperative there. I've certainly talked to some senior military officials who made similar arguments, just noting that, like, part of the reason why they like unmanned systems is for that reason. They're not going to get injured. So they
Yeah.
see value in going, moving that from more of a force protection type role. What that means in terms of like those larger escalations, use of force, I'm unsure, because I think there can also be second and third order effects that come with that in multiple different directions, right? Because one of the issues that you run into is, oh well, first of all, how does the risk aversion affect recruitment? Because maybe not force wide, but certainly there are a number of military specialties where they actually kind of embrace risk acceptance. We think about like special operations forces. Those are the guys who they like being on deployment. They like that sort of visceral fear. Those are the folks who kind of, I don't want to say get off might be a little bit too strong of a language, but they like that experience. There's a thrill that comes with that. In the same way people like go bungee jumping and jump out of airplanes all the time and do things like that. That's normal. That's fine. So to the degree the force becomes risk averse, does that also affect negatively some of the recruitment that comes with some of these other areas where they may not want or trust some of the robots to take over the role? I think there's also questions about the second and third order effects on sort of escalation. That is,
Hmm.
I think there's very clear incentives that if you start having robot wars, your incentives becomes find and kill the operators. And we've seen that in both Russia and Ukraine, where there's been growing incentives, and both of them have been actively trying to find and target and kill the drone operators, because then you're not just killing the machine, you're killing, the operators. Potentially you're losing the information, you're losing the military skill, you're losing the potential to fly multiple numerous drones at the either at the same time or over an extended period of time. And so how does that sort of evolve over time? Because you can also imagine a logic where, okay, let's put our drone operators far away from the actual battlefield. And in some cases, that might be, say, close to a city or another area. So, you might see instead incentives to sort of hit cities and other types of targets, or hit, say, supply depots or production facilities, so that you can destroy many drones at once. Because if it's about a productive capacity, then if you destroy the productive capacity, then you can cause much more damage. But those production facilities might be closer to cities and other types of sensitive targets. So you might see greater levels of escalation because of that, where wars much more quickly go to hitting the homeland, and much bigger concerns that might prompt larger retaliations, when really someone was kind of a little bit upset, but then just but that was the only sort of message that they could send. So you may have more rapid, escalations there.
Well, do you see like this asymmetric advantage, basically leading smaller powers such as Iran to change the balance of power in future conflicts? And the reason I ask is Iran has repeatedly made headlines over the last couple of years
Mhm.
for its drone technologies, but from what I understand, they really aren't a leading military power. And so that's kind of made me wonder if smaller countries could use that as kind of an offset advantage of sorts.
I think absolutely, and I think that's one of the big lessons that we saw in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where the Azeri military made extensive use of drone technology, and was really able to control the skies, and supported that, and used the drones to cause significant defeat on the part of the Armenians. Now, there's a bunch of nuances there, like the Armenian air defense wasn't particularly good. The Azeris were getting help from Turkey, but the fundamental truth is there's plenty of states that have crappy air defense. There are plenty of states that might be on one side or another of a larger state's conflict, where one might get support and the other might not. And so I think that's absolutely a significant concern. But it depends, of course, on the context of that conflict, because in some cases you might have both sides having robust air defenses, or with support from other major powers. In other cases, neither. And so it's going to be very, very regionally and contextually, I guess, contextually significant, how much of an impact there is. But I think fundamentally, though, drones offer a access and control to air that many states may not have, or may not have in any great degree, and in a significant way, where, again, even if you're a small power, but you have some air force, but you only have a handful of F-16s, bombers, whatever, that also makes you risk averse to those things, because, okay, you can use them, but if you only have a couple, it's gonna, and if you lose them, well, you're kind of screwed. And even if you only have a couple, how much time are you actually spending training on that, getting practice, getting military experience? Whereas if you have a bunch of disposable drones, you can just send them up, and potentially, if they're affordable, no big deal at all. The scary part, though, of course, is that that also implies that non-state actors can also get that level of capability, and we've already seen some indications of that, where non-state actors may be able to have localized air superiority over states. Um, of course, we're talking here relatively not significantly empowered states. But even with the United States, in some of the conflicts with the Islamic State, where the Islamic State was very much overwhelming and launching lots of drone attacks, and it was difficult for the U.S. military to bring enough down to really control the air there. And yeah, so if you at least have some localized air control against the United States, how is that going to look against a weak power that has minimal surface to air systems and other electronic warfare and other defensive measures? And I don't think really any state has really thought about or grappled with that in a real way, where these non-state actors can bring real major military power in a way that they couldn't previously against a state.
Well, let me circle back to AI. And again, This topic has been in the headlines repeatedly. I mean, this is probably the number one topic of this year. Um, AI seems to be transforming nearly every technology that it touches, right? I mean, we're seeing it like I'm getting AI prompts in search engines, I'm getting AI prompts in my photo editor. I mean, you name it, whatever we log into now, it seems like AI is involved with it. Do you see AI taking on a more active role with autonomy, with autonomous weapons, with drones? I mean, we've got drone tanks, boats, quadcopters, you name it. There are going to be a lot of mass, as you described, on the battlefield. At some point, it will be very, very difficult to coordinate. Do you see AI taking on a progressively larger role in the future?
In terms of I definitely see application there, but I honestly think it's an open question how significant it'll be. Like, are there applications? Absolutely. I see clearly in terms of using AI for to improve targeting, especially in sort of terminal guidance, where at that last little bit where you might be getting jammed or something like that, where you use the AI to make sure you actually definitely hit the target, I think is potentially significant, as well as for terrain mapping of after when you're being jammed, and you can so that you can navigate in a GNS denied environment in a reasonable way. I think that's potentially significant in terms of enhancing the capabilities. There's also other applications. The one of the big ones that was noted a few years back was DARPA's AI dogfight, where they had a simulated
Mm.
F-16 that was controlled by an AI that was up against a real F-16 pilot, and the AI won, I think 5-0, just completely swamped the F-16 pilot. That said, I think of course a number of technological caveats there. It was a simulation, it wasn't real world, it was in a simplified setting. I think it was just like in the open skies. There wasn't any real complexity there. It wasn't flying an actual jet. So there's obvious caveats there. But one of the bigger ones that I note is that in that case, it makes sense to me why an AI would be more skilled, because for a lot of dogfighting, as I understand, it's very much about sort of the angles and the trajectories and rapidly, recalculating and anticipating movements in three-dimensional space. Where having a really precise advanced calculator that can do that faster is going to be a huge advantage.
Yeah.
And similarly, the AI has no real risk aversion. So, one of the things that we saw in the dogfight was that the AI was more willing to take riskier maneuvers that a real pilot had been trained out of, or it had been suggested that they don't do that in a normal training environment because it would put them at serious risk of a crash during a training. But the AI doesn't have that experience. The caveat, though, I think, is that implies that aerial fights are going to look like dogfights, right? And that's where it's being more significant. Whereas, as I understand, the general trends in air power have been moving away from dogfights. Instead, it's been focused on more long range strike, where it's focused on trying to
Mm.
identify and target your adversary and then hit them with a longer range missile before you get close enough to actually have a dogfight. In which case, okay, then your dogfight test means relatively minimal in terms of the overarching military. Now, of course, you may still have AI applications, in terms of improving targeting. You could think about how AI might be useful to like pick up weak signals that a human might miss, so that you can more readily recognize, like, oh, look, that actually is hey, pay attention. There's a fighter jet coming, and we gotta do something about. So I think it could still be significant there. But the overall point I'm trying to make here is like I see it much more as an augment, a useful one. And I think what makes AI significant is less that it's going to be this wonderful game changer of, now where you have these AI drones and we're just going to destroy everyone or whatever.
Yeah.
And more that there's so many different applications across, not only for drones, but also for manned systems, for logistics support, for intelligence, for defense production, for making literally just memos and improving department efficiencies. So I see the value very much there, where okay, you might only get like a 1 or 2% improvement in efficiency or capability. But if you have 1 or 2% across the entire board of the Department of Defense, that's potentially huge. With our, was
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
$900 billion total defense spending? That's a 1% is that $9 billion worth of increase. Like, okay, that's a pretty huge increase in aggregate, even if it's not like game changing in any specific one instance. So I think AI is very significant, but and I think that hype is actually really good because it encourages people to explore and try those things and figure out which of these areas is it useful, which of it's not, even if it's not transforming everything. It's you need people, you need the motivation to try things and experiment and make things happen. Because if you don't think there's going to be a huge gain, you're not going to bother in the first place.
Well, speaking of trying new things, I wanted to ask about the DoD Replicator Initiative. I have not been following this closely, but I've heard that they were at least providing requirements and narrowing vendor selection. I believe I saw an article a while ago about them significantly narrowing down the number of potential vendors there. Do you know where the Replicator Initiative currently is?
Yeah, so I haven't been following it super closely either. I think there were a couple big developments I have noticed is that I believe that it did select a few potential vendors. Um, I I'm trying to think about the best way to phrase this. Some of my early concerns about Replicator were relieved. Others were, and then new ones sort of emerged to replace that. So both good and bad. So the on the good part, I was initially pretty skeptical about Replicator, not because I thought it was a bad idea, but because I was concerned that the DoD acquisition processes would be too slow, and
Okay.
that the 2 years was an overly ambitious, um, target, especially when in the announcement they put on, or Deputy Secretary Hicks put out a number of requirements related to like we're not just going to make this cheaper, we're going to make this more lethal, it's going to be better against jamming, it's going to be autonomous, it's going to be more autonomous, or whatever. There's a bunch of different requirements. So that made me initially skeptical, and so I was like, okay, how are they going to do this in this short of time frame? But the good part though is that it does look like they went with existing vendors, like someone who already had a relatively well developed product, which meant you can
Okay.
skip some of those early, like you don't have to go through like prototyping and early design and stuff like that. So that makes me more optimistic that they might hit at least some of those initial targets. The concern that I have there though is that I think that misses some of the larger point, in that one of the challenges that we've seen in Ukraine, or maybe not challenge is the right word, but is the innovation cycle where drones are being
Yeah.
very, very quickly changed and improved and then moved to the front lines. I think the innovation cycle for Ukraine is something like 6 weeks or something. It's really short to when they recognize like, okay, Russia has done something, to better to defeat our drones, and within like 6 weeks, Ukraine can field countermeasures and adjustments to address that at scale. So to me, a huge part of that drone fight isn't just like can we build drones, but also can we adapt quickly? Can we go from those early stages to completion? And so I don't think those were really tested within the program. That said, maybe that just wasn't the goal. That's not something that I really thought was important. But I think it does reduce sort of the overall value of the program. Where I see the program having value now is more in terms of like can we incentivize industry to do this at scale and build it rapidly, and then also figure out at least of that sort of like scaling portion, like what are the big roadblocks that we're gonna run into, because the reality is we're not going to be in a war tomorrow. Well, hopefully not in a war tomorrow with
Yeah.
China where we need this. So I think at least to me, I think there's some value in a slower, more iterative process that can figure out like, okay, where are those bottlenecks, and figure it out. Like, okay, we know this piece, and we can fix this piece, and here's the policy, here's the regulatory changes. So if I see it like as part of as one step in a larger process, I don't think it can be a valuable initiative. But if I look at it as like this is what we need tomorrow because we might be in a conflict tomorrow, then I would say no. I think there's lots of issues there. But personally, I read the geopolitical situation as more like it's okay to take a little bit more time to adjust those things. Other folks might disagree with me on that though.
Well, that's an excellent point. I mean, the goal of having these weapons is not to use them, right? They are, I've heard them described as a signaling device. It's there for our security, but our hope is to never have to use these, right? So, and then I think the other aspect of that you'd mentioned was the adaptability part of it. One thing that comes to mind was perhaps by being a little slower, we're able to bypass some of these cycles of adaptation that we're seeing in Ukraine. I mean, they are doing these iterative jumps, right, every 6 weeks, as you mentioned. So maybe by looking at the way that they adapt those, we can skip some of those and, potentially create a more robust framework in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely a fair point. It may be that, the technology matures enough and the approach isn't mature enough that like we don't really need that to some extent. I would still be hesitant about that. Just thinking it from like a risk perspective of, how confident we be, especially when probably there's going to
Yeah.
be, even if like, okay, the UAV aspect, maybe small UAV settles out a little bit, the technology is still growing and still evolving. We still have things like AI and autonomy and swarming and stuff like that. And so I'm certain there's going to be some form of continued innovation, whether it's so quick as
Mhm.
6 weeks, and I'm may not be that quick,
Yeah,
but
that's a
nonetheless,
little fast, but
there might. I would be surprised if there weren't many other forms of innovation that can come. Whether those innovations are critical, that might be more the issue. Is okay, there are some innovations, but they're like around the edges. They aren't really the things that are driving the conflict of the battlefield. But realize I don't know because I don't think anyone knows.
yeah. It's the undiscovered country. Zach, let me thank you so much for your time today. Again, an absolute pleasure and a true honor having you back and speaking with you again. So let me close by asking what is coming up next for you? You are studying for a PhD. It is aligned with your long-term focus on global catastrophes. What else is going on for you as we start to move towards 2025?
Yeah, well, I should have coming out shortly, and possibly by the time this airs, a new study on drone forensics and global security and what that means for larger security issues coming out in RUSI journal, which I'm very very excited about. Also being in the UK, publishing with RUSI makes me very happy. Beyond that, I'm doing some work I'm really excited about on, and might be subject for a future podcast, on globally critical infrastructure, recognizing
Mm,
that states have, for a long time, they've focused narrowly on national infrastructure discussions, things like water, power plants, stuff like that. But increasingly, we have a number of infrastructure systems that are globally critical, where literally the entire world might depend on them. If we think about like submarine cables, where like 99%
yeah.
of global internet traffic goes through like handful of cables. We got satellite infrastructure. Some of the fun ones are like international measurement systems. Like there's only like a single place that calculates, like I think it's a unified timekeeping or something like that. That basically is the basis for all of our timekeeping in the entire world. And there's like one group that does that calculation. So I'm trying to understand what's the risk management and risk analysis challenges that come with that, which I'm having a lot of fun with.
Absolutely. Zach, let me thank you one more time for joining me today, sir.
Yep. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.